Well, hello and welcome again. Thank you very much for coming along to Eco Views and News. We're going to look this evening at a very interesting problem, but one which in effect takes us well beyond the Middle East, where we've been concentrating the last few times, and looking to this broader question of sea level rise on a global scale. Of course, in the Middle East it has very important manifestations, and that's one of the things we want to look at as we go back into this study. Basically, the information that we're getting on the Middle East is pointing to the fact that we're up against two kinds of water problems here. We thought we emphasized in the last several times the kind of water problem having to do with aridity. But in effect, we're going to look for a moment at what's called time and tide, wait for no man, this unstoppable rise of global sea level. It's happening in the Middle East as it is elsewhere, so consider this just part one of a longer series of discussions we're going to have about unstoppable rise of global sea level throughout the world. On one level, as we discussed in the last few times, the Middle East's first water crisis is one of running out of water in some sense. At least in habitable areas here, Turkey's water resources are drying up, and we mentioned this briefly in previous programs. In Syria as well, there are climate refugees on the move at this point in the tens of thousands, and as it was written up in the early 2010 period, this was characteristic of the last few years. In Turkey, there is some discussion about controlling the upper reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates areas, because the dams that are in place in the Turkish government plans are objected to by those who are downstream in Syria and Iraq because of the way it will impact their water usage. In the Mediterranean, around the Mediterranean, there's been a discussion of a water crisis because places like Malta and islands like Cyprus, of course, have experienced extreme drought. But Israel as well has had a water crisis, and as it was discussed here in 2009, led to rationing and quite a bit of government anxiety. In addition, I've referred to the extreme weather events that have come forward in places like Limassol, and in Nicosia itself, the capital city, experienced tornadoes back in 2009. And of course, the Cyprus drought was very pronounced during 2008. It's fortunate that that has subsided a bit in the last year or so. There was enough rain over the last two winters to recharge some of these dams and water impoundments, that is, the lakes behind the dams, to provide water for the area. But there is another water crisis in the Middle East, and that's what we want to focus on today, the other water crisis. Now, it's referred to quite easily as a second water crisis in the Middle East, and in fact around the world, and it has to do with the rising sea. Now, some of you may have seen this book. It's available for public access and reading. It's called The Rising Sea, and I'd urge you to get a copy of it from the library if you can't find it in local bookstores. In any case, start reading it, because it's something that has a global reach. It's not confined to the Middle East, as I say. It's in fact going to be an issue that's seen around the world. We're used to seeing it discussed in other areas, perhaps not the Middle East. Certainly we've all become aware of the problems that are emerging in Alaska as sea level starts to intrude upon particular settlements along the coast, like on Shishmaref. We've seen this discussed.
I am an Inupiaq. I am a full-blooded Eskimo, and I am also American.
Our our people have always worked with nature rather than go against it because it is more powerful and a great force to reckon with. Us Alaska natives up here, we've got a lifestyle and a way of living that's changing real fast.
See it in my face, I'm from this place. Street things is what I chase.
You have to look pretty hard to find Shishmaref on a map. This fragile island takes the first punch from any storm that comes in from the Chukchi Sea off the west coast of Alaska. And as the climate warms, the storms have become more frequent, more violent. Someday soon, they'll wipe Shishmaref off the face of the earth.
Yeah, since I've lived here, this island's really been washing away. It's losing so much ground every year. I had to move out of the house because the seawall was eroding. So I've moved down to the midsection of town, and now I'm back with seawall in my backyard again.
We live in a time of changes that are ever increasing, and the old ways are going away at the same time.
Okay, well, it's been presented here as the last days of Shishmaref, and you can see that a couple of things are happening. With the warming water, there are more violent storms, but in addition, the ice pack has melted back and leaves the coastal areas vulnerable to these storms. The coastal areas are eroded in these storms, and the villages are having to move further and further back into the island. And as it turns out, they're going to have to abandon the island altogether and move to the mainland. This is going to be accomplished, I understand, with some subsidy from the federal government in the United States. But you can see that basically we're having to move population in reference to a changing sea and shore interaction because of the climate changes. Now, some of this will be apparent in other parts of the world as well, and in fact already are apparent. Anybody who followed what was going on in Copenhagen realized that one of the more vocal delegations came from the country of the Maldives in the Indian Ocean. And since Copenhagen, at least, the world has come to know about this small island state and the vulnerability of the small island states in general. The Maldives is a particular case, only one, though, of a whole range of countries, especially those in the Pacific, that are, in effect, becoming vulnerable to shifts in sea level. And we can see some of this discussed in reference to the Maldives very directly. I'll try to call it up here as a link so we can see it. But basically the issue at hand is that sea level is rising faster than people can move.
On the island of Guraidu in the Maldives, Chief Abdul Samad Mumtaz has a problem. Parts of his island are disappearing. He says this beach used to be much larger. There wasn't water here before, he says. And over here, the helipad is half underwater. The creeping sea threatens this tiny island home to 1,616. To be exact, that's 871 men and 745 women, according to the official logbook. Chief Mumtaz says the problem could be explained by that fancy resort on the island next door, which is pumping sand to shore up its beach. But a much larger issue may also be to blame, one that's now much talked about in the Maldives, and that is climate change. Guraidu is just one of over 1,200 tiny islands that make up the Maldives. Sprinkled across 56,000 miles of Indian Ocean, it's a nation of vast natural beauty, whose economy and way of life are completely connected to the sea. The capital city of Malé, where about a quarter of the Maldives' 400,000 people live, is stuffed onto a 3.5 square mile island. It's a devout Muslim nation, where most everyone gets around by boat. It's also one of the lowest lying countries in the world, These tiny islands of coral and sand average around 5 feet above sea level. Some studies predict that climate change could cause sea levels to rise by over 6 feet by the end of the century, which means the Maldives could become uninhabitable.
Time is not with us. Time is against us. We are already living with the consequences of global warming.
It's true, said this group of boys lounging back on Guraidu. They say it seems to be getting hotter and joke that it used to snow. But more seriously, they say they believe climate change is coming, but just don't think there's anything they can do about it. Attitudes like that need to change, says Maldivian President Mohamed Nasheed, who's become somewhat of an international climate change rock star since he took office in 2008.
If we don't act now, my island nation will be submerged by the rising sea.
A political dissident turned president in the country's first democratic election in 30 years, Nasheed quickly made climate change a central part of his agenda and has spent a lot of time trying to make it a central part of the international agenda, too.
We have done nothing that has increased the temperature of the world. We didn't do this, but now we are having to face the first brunt of it. At the end of the day, we are talking about mass murder.
Some say his language is extreme. He says this is an extreme situation, and he'll do what it takes to get people to listen.
Now actually trying to send them a message.
He staged a cabinet meeting underwater to drum up press attention before last December's climate talks in Copenhagen, where he was a prominent figure. He and other small island nations went to the talks with a series of demands they said were vital to save their countries. But for all the agitating, Nasheed came away with few demands met. He defended the accord anyway, saying it was better than nothing at all. So in the meantime, President Nasheed and Vice President Hassan are working to promote environmental issues back at home. But it might be a tough sell, because while people here are becoming more aware of climate change, they're not necessarily as concerned about their own impact on the environment. In Guraidu, Chief Mumtaz showed us a dirty but very open secret: the beach that's used as a dump. In the native Devehi language, one term for beach is Gondu Do, which means a place to throw trash. And that's exactly what happens. But trash on a beach might not seem like a big deal to the locals here, when that beach might disappear in years to come. Which raises a huge question. If rising sea levels make this country uninhabitable, where will everyone go? These Guraidu residents told us they have no idea where they'd end up.
Now this is a common theme that we'll see throughout the world. Where are environmental refugees going to be absorbed? Having contributed virtually nothing to the problem, they're the first level and first instances of the victims of climate change. So the question is, who should absorb them? As countries, as communities, as perhaps nation states trying to deal with this, a new kind of apparatus needs to be devised to cope with the consequences of climate change. This is independent of arguments about how severe it's going to be, or how
President
quickly
Nasheed
it's
has
going to
made
set up.
headlines
We've
with
got to
talk of
set up
moving his entire
mechanisms.
country, but so far, it's just talk. Or what if there were a way to keep people closer to home? We visited the Maldives' most ambitious land reclamation project to get an idea of what that might look like.
The island of Urumae is an artificial island. It was originally built to ease overcrowding in the capital city of Male. It's about 3 feet taller than the other islands around here. And if sea levels rise as they're predicted to, many more Maldivians may have to resettle to islands like this.
This new island was built on top of an old lagoon and is still under construction today. But it's not clear how the Maldives could fund more projects like this, which has cost tens of millions of dollars. A huge price tag for such a small economy. But for what the Maldives lacks in size, it's making up for with big plans. The Maldives has vowed to become the world's first carbon-neutral country by the end of the decade. There's no plan yet how to do it. But when they figure it out, they hope they can be an example to the rest of the world.
There's one beautiful thing about being small. You can try out things on a national scale and show it, and demonstrate it. And then it can be done in bigger countries.
Well, that's the hope. The question is whether going carbon neutral is anything more than a kind of symbolic effort at this point, because they're not going to be able to reverse sea level change. And you can see the idea of creating artificial islands by building them up a bit is a bit like what we're doing here in the States by building up barriers, say, around New Orleans. There's a bit of an effort, as you know, to protect New Orleans with a storm surge barrier. But if New Orleans is subsiding, as geologists say it is, at the same time that sea level is rising, these storm barriers may buy a decade or two, as they do in Venice, but they're not long-term solutions to these problems. On the contrary, they may just be making people more vulnerable to bigger storms in the future. So we need to look beyond the question of building up artificial islands and start thinking about what we're going to do in reference to the whole Eastern Mediterranean. There are a lot of areas here that are vulnerable to the water crises we've seen before of drought. But what about towns like Alexandria in Egypt that are right on the water's edge? It has a very vulnerable harbor and population sitting within a few meters of sea level. Professor Salah Soliman of Alexandria University has started to look into this. Alexandria University is one of the areas in which there's been some discussion about these issues, and he's pointed out that they're looking at the negative effects of climate change in a very serious way at this point, because they're likely to be very direct victims of it. According to the IPCC report, the synthesis report of 2007, they were singled out as one of the 3 areas most vulnerable to climate change. And Dr. Mohammed Al-Harey has looked into this as a professor of environmental physics in Alexandria and suggests that maybe 5 to 6 million people are vulnerable here. When this is discussed among others, it's very clear that people are saying it will affect us all, it will affect the rest of the world. But especially the Egyptians feel it will affect them. It will affect the future, our development, everything, as this woman says. Let's follow the reporting on this, because it's really quite touching in a way and very dramatic. There's been a report put out by Sophie McNeil that I think is worth watching here, if we can call it up a second. It's quite a dramatic case, but something I think we should all keep clearly in mind, because we're going to be seeing this around the world.
Amid all the hubbub about the impact of global warming, it probably won't surprise you to learn that one affected area of the globe is Egypt's low-lying fertile Nile Delta, the nation's food bowl. So much so that Egyptian authorities are faced with the prospect of millions being forced to flee rising sea levels. Here's Sophie McNeil.
Summer in the Egyptian city of Alexandria. Once, this harbour was the centre of trade and learning throughout the Mediterranean Sea. Its famous library had no equal, and its then lighthouse was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Both the Greeks and the Romans conquered this prized city, but Alexandria is now thought to be at risk from far more powerful forces. This water lapping at the shores could threaten its very existence.
This is the main point, because, you know, most of the people here will be asking about the impact of climate change.
Professor Salah Solomon of Alexandria University is organizing a special documentary screening. While global warming is a hot issue in the West, it hasn't been high on the policy agenda in the Middle East. But Professor Solomon is on a mission to bring Al Gore's message to the attention of his fellow Egyptians.
مش لأن احنا مهتمين أو عايزين نهتم بيه، ولكن كل الدراسات اللي هي أصبحت يعني مؤكدة بتقول إنه مصر واحدة من الدول الأكثر عرضة للآثار السيئة اللي هتحدث من تغير المناخ. أنا بدعو حضراتكم كباحثين إن احنا بس ناخد رحلة من اسكندرية
Global warming not only increases precipitation worldwide, but it also relocates the precipitation.
Much of the West's focus is preoccupied with the effect of climate change on their cities and their way of life.
The Netherlands, one of the low countries, absolutely devastating.
But it's the developing countries that are tipped to be the worst affected by rising sea levels.
Egypt is being now considered as one of the most 3 countries going to be attacked or affected by climate change.
In 2007, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change pinpointed the top 3 regions in the world that will be worst affected if global sea levels rise. They are the delta areas of the Mekong River in Vietnam, the Ganges Delta in Bangladesh, and the Nile Delta of Egypt. It has some Egyptians seriously concerned.
أكيد إن ده زي ما بيأثر عندنا هيأثر على جميع الدول وإحنا كلنا بينا تعاون فلازم نخاف كلنا على بعض فده ليه تأثير كبير علينا وهيأثر على المستقبل قدام وعلى التطور وعلى كل حاجة.
Studies have estimated that if the global ice caps do melt, sea levels could rise between 50 centimetres to 1 metre within the next 50 to 100 years. This is the predicted effect of just a 50 centimetre sea level rise on the Egyptian coast. It would displace more than 10% of Egypt's population.
I would estimate, something between 5 and 6 million people.
Would have to move.
Yes, they would have to move.
Okay, well, 5 and 6 million people would have to move, 10% of Egypt's population. This is quite an extraordinary impact that's already being foreseen for this region here. Just with half a meter, that is, with basically 1.5 feet of sea level rise, all of these areas would be inundated. And it raises the question about the entire eastern Mediterranean. What about other coastal areas in the Middle East where there's very little room? As in the case here, you could see Cairo is the capital city, but Alexandria is the threatened area with basically no margin. The same is true of the Gaza Strip. Now, the Gaza Strip has been in a lot of news recently, and you can realize why in reference to the contention between Israel and the Palestinians. But if you look at the vulnerability of this area, it's really quite extraordinary. There's one road that goes along the very edge of the Mediterranean, and the rest of the population is very close to sea level in any case. Same is true with Cyprus. Cyprus is surrounded by water, obviously as an island, but its major cities are things like Limassol here, which if you zoom in on, you can see is right along the sea here. They've just put in hundreds of millions of dollars in restoring and maintaining a seafront for this town. And it's quite attractive to foreign visitors and guests. But basically there's a new kind of water crisis that is going to have to be anticipated, not just the availability of fresh water, but what in effect is happening with the unstoppable rise of global sea levels. We'll keep an eye on this and keep in touch as we go forward to look at this as only one part one, of a series that we'll be looking at in reference to sea level rise. Thank you very much. Hope to talk to you soon about other issues.